Go for it.
Hello and welcome to the PFL Show, part of the MMA Today podcast network. I'm John Franklin of MMA Today, and I'm joined this week by Nolan King of course, the MMA Today, as well as Flow Combat and Tapology. Nolan, how are you?
Doing well, man. I can't complain. Weather's getting nice here in Massachusetts, which we only have this. We can only complain about the hot weather for like 2.5 months a year. So I'm thoroughly enjoying complaining about how hot it is, and we'll be back to winter.
Yeah, we get to do that for about 10 months in Phoenix.
Yeah.
So, all right, Nolan, the PFL stopped this week in our nation's capital, a place of chaos and controversy. And while there was plenty of organized chaos on this card, largely the controversy from the last card was absent. So this is the third card of this young promotion. Talk to me about what your feelings were going into this night.
Yeah, I mean, this was the night that I felt like would be kind of not make it or break it, because they've had such a successful tenure, but it would definitely put a stamp on top of the success that they've already had. The welterweight and middleweight divisions are, historically can be sometimes, depending on the fighters you have in there, can be the ones that the fights have the potential to kind of drag. You don't have the heavyweight mass where guys are going to get, most times guys will get knocked out in the first round. You don't have the speed and excitement of the lighter weights. It's kind of just, everybody's stuck in the middle. And we've seen it in the UFC where the top 15 guys are great. And then, you start getting to middle tier, lower tier, and it seems like it's hard for these guys to stick around, get some consistency, or even for the UFC to find a solid, deep roster of these type of fighters. Welterweight's a little different. That's more for middleweight, but yeah, man, I that was my expectations going in. I thought that this could either put a stamp on it or could not necessarily make them take a step back, but just make people, have to make their judgment after a couple more events.
Absolutely. So typically what we do on the show you've been on before, obviously, is we'll break it down based on weight class and then by the points accrued in the fights. And sort of go that way. I think it just keeps it a lot easier. And at the end of talking about, we'll start with welterweight. At the end of talking about welterweight, we'll take a look at the welterweight standings, go over them, and then move over to middleweight. Same thing, and then we'll get out of here with a brief sort of look at PFL 4. All right, so let's start in welterweight, 170 pounds, 6-point fights on the night. The first one that we are going to be talking about is João Zeferino and Paul Bradley, the Brazilian samurai. João Zeferino took on Paul the Gentleman Bradley and was no gentleman himself, blasting Bradley with strikes en route to a first-round victory. And I put 5 points here, but it was 6 points. So Zeferino looked good. He was kind of up and down when he was in the World Series of Fighting. Looked great at times. He went to the finals of the tournament for the shot at Justin Gaethje against Brian Foster. Looked good in that tournament. What'd you see in this fight? I mean, how'd Zeferino look?
I mean, I think he looked awesome. I think, obviously we're going to be spending more time talking about him than the fight actually took. That was a quick finish of Paul Bradley, and Bradley's a tough guy to put away, man. We saw his fight against Alexander Shlemenko not too long ago. He was, he has a chin, so he's just a tough guy. One of those guys that's like a high risk, low reward matchup. But Zeferino looked great. I mean, he's coming off of 3 straight losses, I believe, and moving up to welterweight a couple fights ago. I wasn't really sure how he would do entering this tournament at a welterweight as opposed to a lightweight, but he looked great, man. That's exactly the type of start you want to have in this type of tournament. I'm not really sure I can really say much else about it. It was just an impressive performance, and he put Bradley down.
It was, and if you're someone who is fascinated by statistics, I'll give you the statistics courtesy of PFLMMA.com. 15-24 was João Zeferino. 0 for 11 was Paul Bradley on his strikes. So Zeferino moves forward with 6 points to the top of the division, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Up next, Magomed Karamov defeated Herman Tirado by submission in the first round as well. Going into this fight, again, like I said, he wasted very little time finding Herman Tirado's back and strangling him. And credit or not credit to Tirado, however you look at it, he hung in there. It was no tap for him. He went out. The first round win earned the Russian 6 points and a tie with João Zeferino at 170 pounds. Again, another quick fight, a little bit different, obviously, based on the finish. What'd you see in this one?
Yeah, I mean, it's just the Russian invasion continues. We saw it a little bit towards the end of the WSOF brand, and towards, the PFL had those I think there was 3 or 4 non-tournament events, before they officially rebranded into the tournament format. But yeah, man, he's just another scary Russian fighter. And while their names may be hard to pronounce, there's some serious talent coming out of Russia now. I think you always like to hype countries and say, oh, Ireland had an influx to the UFC, and England's had its share of UFC fighters. But I think the Russian invasion, man, it's only going to get better from there. It seems like I saw somebody tweet it the other day where it was like, if you don't know a fight, bet on the Russian and you'll always walk away. If you keep doing it, you always make money just because they win more times than not. So, yeah, man, he continued it. And, another guy that's, went out there and capitalized and got his 6 points and is tied for first place in the tournament.
And, we'll have to do this on the site at some point. I think it'd be a fun little feature to do. The sport is really only 25 years old, basically. I mean, obviously there's been some stuff before UFC, but I mean, in large part, that's how old it is. And, you start to figure out and see the lineage of these guys. What effect does Khabib Nurmagomedov have on some of these other fighters in the movement? Like you're talking about the Russian movement. What effect did GSP have on the Canadians? What effect did Bisping have on the Brits? And I think, like you said, what effect did Conor McGregor have on the Irish? So as this thing moves along, that's what I'm interested to see. When we have these Russian fighters coming over and being so successful, what wave are they gonna? I mean, obviously the future is now for them, but also what could be coming. All right, the 5-point fights in the 170-pound division. We'll start with the headliner, which was Ray Cooper with a victory over Jake Shields. The history between Ray Cooper and Jake Shields is well documented. Shields fought and defeated Cooper's father, and this fight was to settle family business. And Cooper did just that at 209 in the second round via strikes, finishing Jake Shields and, again, earning 5 points. Coming into this fight, obviously Shields is the name. How did you see it? Were you thinking Shields was going to just go through him? Were you thinking that – I mean, Cooper was a huge, huge underdog at plus 800. Shields was a minus 1,400 favorite. So, I mean, I think the fact that the family stuff was so much of a part of the way they promoted it, I think how big of an underdog Cooper was kind of got lost, no?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of – and it's not necessarily like that it's PFL's fault or anything, because I think that – and I was kind of thinking this is always storylines, but they always kind of run along. And even though I still get excited about them, a lot of times with MMA storylines, kind of run along the same lines. Like, oh, somebody, said they beat me in training, or, this is the trilogy match because we fought twice before, things like that. But with this fight, it was extreme. It was very different. It was a kind of unusual circumstance. So I think that, that made the fight significant within itself. And like you said, the fact that Cooper was such a big underdog did kind of get lost. And to answer your first question, how did I think Shields was just going to run through him? I thought that the best case scenario for Cooper would be that Shields would lay on top of him for 3 rounds and he'd lose a unanimous decision 30-27. Thought the worst case scenario for Cooper would be if Shields just ran through him. So, I didn't see Cooper winning the fight, never mind being able to put away a tough UFC, former UFC title challenger in that fashion. I thought that was incredible. And again, man, PFL, somebody said to me after the fight, PFL, it must suck because, the people that they're trying to promote, like Jake Shields, like we're going to talk about Nurmagomedov in a little bit, like, both those guys lost, so that must hurt them. And I kind of disagree with that because I think that only makes the tournament stronger. Shields and Nurmagomedov, they can still make the playoffs. They're still relevant. You don't have to, in this type of format, you don't have to write off a fighter that's making a title push or a push towards a championship. Now Ray Cooper's made a name for himself, and they still have Jake Shields, who's still relevant. So I think it was a pretty amazing feat, and I honestly think PFL should be pretty happy with the way things have played out because they're getting this notoriety of what's going on in the short term, and I think the long term won't be hurt too much by it.
Absolutely. And now the interesting thing we talked about early on in the PFL show is that when Jake Shields fights next, he has more urgency. He has to kind of get to it to sort of make up for his loss, which makes that a more compelling fight. Whereas in a traditional sense, he might drop a fight and he would actually be a lot more hesitant in in his first fight back, trying to just, eke out a win. Maybe he's, not taking as many chances as he would. Now you almost have to take chances to get, to pick up on the points that you may have missed out on. For you guys who love the stats, let's take a real quick look at them. Really an efficient. This is why I like stats, and I like and there's also the gap where stats don't tell you the whole story. A super efficient fight for Jake Shields, 29 of 33 in strikes, 14 of 16 leg strikes, 15 of 16 ground strikes. And for Cooper's part, he was just way busier, 24 of 62, but then he hits the big ones. So stats don't always tell you the story. Obviously, Shields was fighting a very clean fight, and then, Cooper found the big shot. All right, up next, Pavel Kush and Abubakar Nurmagomedov, like you had spoken about. When your last name is Nurmagomedov, the target is always large, and Abubakar is certainly not exempt of that. That target was hit or rather choked on this night by Pavel Kush, second round at 123 under the Ukrainian, 5 points in the welterweight division, and a three-way tie. Again, we'll get to that in the standings in a second. Like you already alluded to, Jake Shields, big name, loses. Nurmagomedov, big name, loses. On the one hand, yeah, we have our guys losing, but the tournament format allows them to sort of come back, and now we're building more stars.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, Kush's performance was, was equally as impressive to Cooper's, just in the fact that he went in, and maybe even more impressive. Nurmagomedov was a guy that the UFC was looking at. He was in deep talks to debut with them this year, ended up, kind of turning away and going with the PFL and entering the tournament. So it's one thing to put away Shields, who, has the name recognition, but is also kind of a little older. I'm not saying Shields is like over the hill or anything. I'm just saying, like, we've seen him lose in the past recently, things like that. He doesn't necessarily have this aura about him that he's, like this unstoppable young fighter who's on the come up, whose brother is, an absolute killer. So for Kush, who's, I think, especially here, was even more, more of an unknown than maybe Cooper even was. At least some people in the U.S. knew Cooper from the regional scenes and whatnot. Kush just went in there, man, and I could have seen him. If you told me, oh, this big underdog was going to win, Kush was going to beat Nurmagomedov, how would he do it? I would have thought submissions. That's kind of what his bread and butter is. But for him to go out there and put Nurmagomedov down and then finish him, man, that's just like an exclamation point on top of a win, man. Even though he gets the points, it's a little added bonus, I think, just for the hype behind him going forward.
And I think as we move over to the stats, when you take a look at them, you talk in other sports about filling a stat sheet, and Kush certainly did that. I mean, he has his lot of strikes thrown, not a high percentage landed necessarily, but like you said, he had some takedown attempts, he had some submission attempts, knocked Nurmagomedov down twice in one dominant position. So he really filled the stat sheet and really went after Nurmagomedov in a lot of very different ways, and ultimately, found the win. Okay, moving on. Bojan Velikovic fought first and ended the night in second as he defeated Jonathan Weston with strikes in the second round, picking up 5 points. What'd you see in this one?
Yeah, man. I mean, Bojan was one of the few guys that I think went, pretty much directly from his UFC contract to the PFL. He was a name that I believe at the time that the rosters were released for PFL, people didn't even know that he wasn't in the UFC anymore. So he might have been, he might have still been able to re-sign with them and gone in this direction. I know it's kind of like speculation, but if he did do something like that, it seemed like this was a good idea on his part, because he looked great. I thought, I can't necessarily speak to Jonathan Weston's credentials prior to this fight, but I thought Velikovic looked good, and I think it will be interesting. He's left himself open for a lot of interesting matchups going forward in this tournament.
And I think, again, here we talk about, what becomes the story in PFL. And I think we get a little bit of both, the fighters and the format. So here you look at a guy, like you said, who started the night as the very first fight. And, I guess as I said, but he started the night as the very first fight and ends up in second place in his division. And I think that really has to make these fighters think it doesn't matter where I appear on the card. Some may, as we move forward and as this thing goes from year to year, maybe towards the end of the year, they may like fighting first. They're like, what the hell's the difference? I mean, my pay is my pay. Before a main event sort of meant something, and it still does. I mean, you're the guy in the poster, you're the guy bringing the eyes if you're Jake Shields. But here, you might fly a little bit under the radar and then be able to have a really good performance. All right, so there were no 4-point fights. The 3-point fight was Rick Story defeated Yuri Villafort by unanimous decision. So let's go ahead and take a look at the standings. At 170 pounds, at the very top is Joao Zeferino. He is tied with Magomed Karimov They both have 6 points. Then we have Kush, Cooper, and Velikovic all have 5. Rick Story has 3, and the rest of the card did not score any points. That gets interesting for guys like Yuri Villafort, Jake Shields, and also Abubakar Nurmagomedov, Paul Bradley, for all of them really. But again, now when you're facing a 6-point deficit to a guy like Joao Zeffirino, now the way this kind of cuts off, Villafort and Weston don't have any points, so they're, at least as it shows on the website, above the cut, right? So it'll be interesting. Obviously, if Shields or Nurmagomedov get a win, there's a chance they still could get in. But if Villafort and Weston, it gets interesting. That's one of the things I like about this this format. All right, let's move on to middleweight. Our 6-point fights. So I am going to give this name the old college try, and if I completely shred it, let me know. So I'm going to go with Abusupyan Magomedov defeated Danilo Villafort by TKO via strikes in the very first round. How'd I do?
Yeah, that was good, man. It was a lot better than I would have done. I have a feeling you might have been practicing that one. That was a little too smooth.
I did practice it. You got me. I tried to practice a couple times. So Abusupyan was second on your bout card, but he was first in the standings after he finished Villafort with strikes in the very first round. What'd you see here? I mean, Danilo Villafort's a name we've heard before, and I think that if I had heard Magomedov's name before, I would have remembered it. So obviously, he wasn't on anybody's real radar move, except for guys that are, look at the deep cuts like you. How much of a surprise was this to you, or what'd you expect going in?
Yeah, again, man, it's just like bet on the Russians. I think that, Villafort, obviously a guy that was known for his UFC tenure. He's had some success outside the UFC since that time. But, another young, fresh, hungry, I guess he's actually German-born, but I'm assuming obviously he's got Russian blood in him. Magomedov looked great. I thought that the body kick finish was really cool. The way that the kick was thrown, it was kind of like from the opposite side of where you would usually see a body kick thrown when Villafort was turned. So it was kind of a cool finish for the highlight reels. And yeah, again, man, I kind of hoping some of these Russian guys get paired up against one another, because I think we could have some pretty savage, violent fights on our hands.
I don't want to be a prisoner of the moment, and I think that people that don't watch some of these fights as much as you and I do, especially my history with the World Series of Fighting, when you watch these fights and you watch some of the highlight packages, it really seems like these guys are going for it. But I do remember in the World Series of Fighting, guys went for it. So do you think that it's just at this level guys are going for it, or do you really think the format's playing a role in that?
I actually really think that the format is playing a role. I just think, it's one thing for, there's certain fighters out there that this plays right into their hands. So maybe it doesn't affect them as much, guys that just want to go out there and put on an exciting finish, stuff like that. But as we're going to talk about here in a minute, in the middleweight division, John Howard, who I'm sure we're going to assess his fight here, but he hadn't had a finish for like 5 years, and he went out and had one. There's just a certain, I think that the fact that $1 million is just hanging over everybody's head, it's hard for them not to go out and at least, go balls to the wall and try. I really can't figure out any other explanation. Because even with again, I think we've compared it to this in the past, is when there's such incentive on the line with Contender Series. And, I'm still waiting for them to have a bad episode of that show. I mean, it's been 12 episodes in overall, and, we haven't seen one episode that's been a stinker. And I feel the same way with PFL. We've had 3 events now, and they've all brought us an extreme amount of action compared to other MMA events. And I really don't have any other explanation. It's either luck or it is the incentive, in my opinion.
I'm with you. I think it's the incentive. And I think that, something that we all were so skeptical about. I mean, if you heard what the PFL was going to do, and the second you heard it, you said to yourself, you know what? That's going to be a crackerjack of a promotion, man. Watch those guys. You'd be lying. I mean, most people heard it and they were like, they were either confused by it. They may have been intrigued. I'll give best case scenario that MMA media was intrigued, but most were like, all right, this is a gimmick. This is them trying to get their heads above water. They really look like geniuses in this. I mean, we don't know what the long term is for it. I mean, who knows what can survive in the shadow of the UFC, but I really think that they thought this out really well, and it's paying dividends for them, and good on them, because they're a bunch of great guys. All right, 5-point fight, the aforementioned John Doomsday Howard He took on, let's get into the intro. John Doomsday Howard has had an up and down career on this night. Ghassan Umalatov was served up, and Howard took him down and choked him at 259 in round number 2 for 5 points in the middleweight division. John Howard's one of these guys that we always kind of have expected more from. He'll have a good performance, and then you think, okay, he's on his way, and a lot of guys are that way. We were just talking about Tony and I about Uriah Hall and all these different guys that you think, okay, this is the fight that's going to trigger them, and then they have a letdown. But Howard seems to be settled in well in this promotion. And what'd you see in this one? What'd you like?
Yeah, I can speak to John's his road through MMA because he's not from very far away from me. He grew up outside of Boston in Dorchester, kind of a rough neighborhood, and when he first made it to the UFC, he was knocking guys out. He had heavy hands. He was becoming somebody that fans were really looking forward to seeing just because of his power, his comebacks, things like that. And then all of a sudden, somewhere in the mix, this all got lost. He got cut from the UFC. He got brought back, and it just seemed like he didn't still have that same killer instinct where he'd go for. I don't know if it's not necessarily that he wouldn't go for finishes, but a lot of his fights, even his opponents, I just maybe the way he fights just makes it hard for him to engage or have his opponent engage in these firefights where the knockout opportunities would present themselves. With that being said, I thought that, going into this fight, I wasn't really sure what John would look like. I thought his last couple fights, the two for WSOF that he had looked kind of so-so. Granted, he was fighting, Nurmagomedov was one of the fights. But with that being said, man, I think he looked great. I think he went out there and he started to, it was a big step forward compared to all these little steps back he'd been taking. And he got that finish against another guy that was a UFC veteran. I believe Howard was an underdog in this fight too, almost 2-1 underdog. So, pretty good performance by him all around. He gets on the board and, maybe he's reinvented himself a little bit. It leaves that question open is he going to is this, what kind of John Howard are we going to get now? He broke the trend of going backwards. So maybe we're going to get a John Howard that goes forward.
Maybe, and here's another thing I think, and it's funny. The reason why I like doing this podcast with you is because you're a very focused guy, and you can kind of keep us on track. And then I get abstract, and I start to get outside the lines. And you definitely color in the lines, Nolan, and I color outside of them. But so this is what I want to talk to you about, though, in the wake of what you just said, which is that I like this format for a lot of reasons, but one of them is a guy like John Howard, right? So if you're having your career and you're in Bellator, you were formerly in World Series of Fighting, or you're in LFA, everything is, where is my career going? Like, what does this fight mean to my career? Am I on my way back to the UFC? Am I ever going to be there again? Am I on my way to Bellator? Am I contending for LFA's belt? All these different questions about your career. But this kind of hones everything into just, like, you can exist just on this plane. Like, my immediate future is, I don't have to worry about everyone else in my division. I mean, I do and I don't. But, it's win in advance. And it's one of those things where I like the immediacy of this format. Like, this is John Howard's focus. Where his career is going is a little bit irrelevant right now to his focus. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
and they all have the same focus.
Yeah, no, 100%. I've started to kind of, it's been a year now that I've really been, talking to these fighters and interviewing them and stuff. And it seems to me that, like, a lot of these, the intangibles just from preparation that go into fights and focus and things like that, and not having distractions in your life, like, they go such a long way. There's been times, especially with the Contender Series and like big level LFA fights, things like that, even going to the UFC or the Ultimate Fighter, things like that, where I just, I look at it and I'm like, maybe this guy shouldn't be in this opportunity, or I think he's going to get smoked or whatever. And then it will just be like night and day. He'll put on an excellent performance, and I'll have talked to him, and he'll say, I had a lot going on in my life. I was working a second job, but this opportunity allowed me to financially be able to focus all the time, things like that. So I think that's a huge, huge, huge one. And I think the other thing that, going in line with that the PFL provides in the tournament format, is that you don't have to be perfect. It allows you to have your mulligan, have, the ability to screw up once. If you lose, you're not out of the running for the championship. Whereas if you were in the UFC, and you're on this trajectory and you're trying to climb and build and get to the championship, a loss is gonna nullify that for you. Essentially, it's gonna make you have to go back to the start, where that's not the case here. So I think the fact that it's allowing fighters to not only, the cash is pretty good, even if you don't win the tournament. But also on top of that, it's allowing fighters to be able to take risks, at least in one fight, to be able to go out there and try to go balls to the wall and put on an exciting performance.
Absolutely. All right, moving on to the 4-point fight. Lewis put the guns down. Taylor had the guns down for 2 rounds, but in the third came out blasted and took out Anderson Goncalves by TKO. He earned 4 points in the middleweight division. Lewis Taylor's a guy in the World Series of Fighting I always liked. I mean, he always had some good performances. He always came to fight. So how do you think he's looking here?
Yeah, I think he looks great. Again, he's a guy that was a little bit older. And sorry, my computer keeps binging, but just bear with me here. And yeah, Lewis Taylor, a guy that I thought looked great. Outside of the UFC, he got signed to the UFC, and then he never got the opportunity to compete in the UFC. Pulled out with an injury before his debut and got cut. One of the few cases where that's happened in UFC history. But yeah, I thought that this was just another fight where he just went out there and showed that age is sometimes in MMA just a number. Looked great. He landed like a 10-punch combination on Anderson Goncalves, and he got the points enough for a finish.
Absolutely. He was the guy who almost was able to really put on a very interesting run to end his World Series of Fighting time. So he beat Corey Davila. He beat Phil Hawes, who was very highly touted at the time, choked him out, choked out Davila, choked out Hawes, and then next thing you know, he's fighting David Branch for the title. Now, he lost to Branch, but, I mean, that could have been a really interesting run for him. And now here you go again. So now that was 2016, right? So he's 39 now. He was 37 then. So, I mean, if Lewis Taylor gets a little bit behind him here, if he wins another fight, now you're talking about here's a guy 39 in a young man's sport who's making a run for this $1 million. I mean, that's a story if ever one was to be written. I mean, that's something that can make it to like a NBC Sports main page, a guy like Lewis Taylor making a run. So, there's so many guys on this roster. Again, here I go being abstract. There's so many guys on this roster that there's just so many narratives to be told as this thing moves along. All right, let's get to the 3-point fights in middleweight. We'll go over the standings, and then we'll get you out of here with a quick look at PFL 4. 3-point fights on the night at middleweight where Shamil Gamzatov defeated Eddie Gordon by unanimous decision, 30-27, 29-28, 29-28. Bruno Santos defeated Sadibou Sy by unanimous decision, 29-28 all the way. Rex Harris defeated Andre Lobato by split decision, 29-28, 29-28, and then 28-29, obviously. So if we take a real quick look at the standings at middleweight, at the very top is Abusi. See, I wasn't ready for it this time. I practiced earlier. I'm not ready now. So we'll just call him Abus Magomedov because that's how he's listed on the standings with 6 points. Second place is John Howard with 5. Third place is Lewis Taylor with 4. Then Shamil Gamzatov, Bruno Santos, and Rex Harris all tied at 3. So, again, not as many big names that don't have points at 185 pounds. Obviously, Eddie Gordon's got a name. Danilo Villafort has a name. So, when you look at the standings there, it's not like you're expecting these guys. I mean, they could be, sort of out of it in terms of, a guy like Jake Shields you expect to rebound. A guy like Abubakar Nurmagomedov you expect to rebound. So how are you feeling? Obviously, we just went over the standings. So let's take a look at the card in both divisions as a whole. Are you feeling good about 170, 185 pounds in this format?
Yeah, I think so. I think it was kind of across the board. It was one of the more level divisions to begin with. We didn't have a favorite, per se. I guess Nurmagomedov was kind of a favorite, but not in the same way that like an Andre Harrison is a favorite, or, you kind of look at some of these divisions and you're like, that guy has a really good chance of winning this whole thing. So I think that it was level playing field to begin with, relatively. And I think it's kind of stayed that way because, people still expect Shields, like you said, Shields to get a win, Nurmagomedov to get a win. So, yeah, I mean, coming down to crunch time, I think that these two divisions could, be very tight. I think that some tiebreakers may need to come into effect. I'm assuming it's going to have, tiebreakers are going to have to happen in maybe every division, just with the way that there's only a couple of first, regular season performances from each fighter. But yeah, man, I'm feeling pretty good about it. Another really good PFL event. Again, like I said, Wasn't sure how exciting the fights would be in these divisions, but they played out pretty well and got people talking, and it kept people talking.
And again, on that note, just to talk about, so like I said, it's been well stated and documented in this podcast that I've covered the World Series of Fighting, but I don't know that you and I would be covering the World Series of Fighting as it was previously constructed with the level of excitement we're covering the PFL. I mean, it has its own show on our podcast network. Not that World Series of Fighting wouldn't have, but I think that, I don't know, especially you with everything you have going on, your level of interest in the PFL is kind of like, is a little bit of a dog whistle for me to let me know that, okay, if Nolan's disinterested in it, then there has to be something there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I even tweeted, I think after the last event, that this is, in line, in my opinion, this is like the 2018 version of what the Contender Series was. I think, if hopefully the money and everything remains, PFL as a business continues or starts moving towards a point where, they can carry this out for years to come, because I think, this is like the experiment almost. And by word of mouth and by buzz and by social media and stuff, like a year from now, I think that this could have all, a huge push, a huge, I don't want to call it bandwagon because there's not really a wagon to begin with. It's so new, but I think people should definitely be excited with the direction that it's going, because I think it is. That's what I was saying. Back to my tweet. That I think this is the best thing in MMA since Contender Series. As far as new ventures go, new angles, things like that. So let's keep going. Let's keep prodding. Plugging in and going in the right direction. And I think we've got another promotion on our hands that is going to compete with the big, the big dog in the UFC.
I agree. In the direction they're going in right now is Long Island, New York. That's the next card, PFL 4. And unlike some of the other times that we've sort of briefly previewed this, fans, I won't even get into that with Nolan right now. I mean, this is really a stacked card. They're going back through the divisions again. So this to me is the upside to the way they do things, right? So for example, you have, and again, here's another name I'm probably gonna smash, and I got it good the first time, but Lance Palmer and Tikshin Jumabike, close enough.
Sounds good to me.
All right, Andre Harrison, Nazareno Malagiri. I mean, these are all guys that I believe were victorious the first time around. Babula Bekbulat Magomedov, Idrisov, Francimar Barossa, and Jack May. That's going to be a great fight. Alexander Almeida and Steven Seiler. That's going to be a great fight. Timur Valiev and Lee Colville. Alex Nicholson and Felipe Lins, Sean Jordan and Josh Copeland, Jared Rochelle and Kevin Tiller. I mean, this is a good card for the fourth card. And so where we thought maybe that as this thing moves along, they'd run out of gas, they're refueling based on the way they're doing the format, which I like a lot. I mean, this is a good card to be the fourth card that we thought, okay, somebody's bound to get hurt or this or that or the other. And don't let me forget Max Koga and Marcus Galval. So, yeah, I mean, I like this card a lot. Like when I brought it up, I was thinking it was going to be similar to the first three cards where there's some highlights. I think the first three cards there's a few guys that we thought were going to do well, and then we had some surprises, and we're like, oh shit, if these guys show up, if the Ray Coopers and all these guys, that's what the first three cards were. Like, who's going to be the surprises? Now we're starting to get more loaded cards because the guys that we didn't think that didn't have a name before their first fight, like Jack May, now he's fighting a guy. And you're like, oh, shit, I want to watch Jack May fight because he knocked this guy dead 2 months ago.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So yeah. I think the shortened, it's crazy, Nolan. We talked about this, I think, in the first one, that the shortened season might hurt them. It might help them because now Jack May's front of mind. Now Alex Nicholson's front of mind because the fights didn't happen that long ago. So I'm intrigued by this. What do you think about this card?
Yeah, I think it's great. I think that, like you said, I wasn't really sure, especially with the short turnaround, how many of these guys would be able to compete, but it seems like most of them are. The only thing that I'm more curious about is the fact that, you looked at the first card, and I believe, I'll have to go back and look, but I think there was 6 heavyweight matchups, and I think this one only has 4 heavyweight matchups. So I'm just curious, I was kind of wondering what they would do in terms of like suspensions and stuff. If you look at the fighters that are missing out of this event, Daniel Gallimore, he obviously had that gross cut in the fight that they had to waive off the fight. There was who's the guy that Kelvin Tiller knocked out? I'm blanking, but he obviously got a medical suspension. Kyle Alankar, whatever his name is. So, I was curious to see if they would have guys like on standby that they would bring in, or how that would work. For example, like I think in this case it worked out, well, where they might have had an even number, but I was curious what would happen if they had an odd number. What if there was one guy, he's like, I'm ready to go, and they don't have an opponent. So I'm interested to see if like there'll be some last second additions or something, or if they're just going to do it. Whereas if you get hurt and they have an even number of guys that are going to fight, if they're just, not even going to bother, you're in the tournament or you're not type of deal. But I thought that was something that was a question I had coming into it, what would happen. So with that being said, I think that this tournament, this event still looks really good. I think that, it's a lot better than I thought would happen, especially with New York commissions being so strict and suspensions and things like that. So I'm excited for it, man. It's right in line with everything else that the excitement that's been building for me. And now we're back to the start, and we get to see a second round, a second go.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm super excited about it too. And guys, we'll keep doing PFL shows, and we'll try and get them as close to the events as we can this week. Obviously, International Fight Week played a role in that. I was in Vegas, so. But yeah, I'm really excited about this promotion. I'm really excited about the next card. So they're and I mean, listen, Nolan, we're hardcores. I mean, this is what we do. So I'd be interested to see how they get the other 85% or the other 80% of casuals. And maybe the answer to that is whenever the guy wins the million, he's all over social media, buying his mom a house or whatever. And that may incentivize the guys for next season. So maybe that's.
I honestly, not to interrupt you, I honestly think that will be something that is really easily promoted outside of the sport of our outside of the circle of our hardcore fans. If you're on TV changing the channels and you come across an event where every fighter is winning $1 million, that's something that I think it's one of the few angles I've seen from a promotion like Bellator or PFL or WSOF, where I think it will bring in people that aren't hardcore MMA fans or aren't just tuning in because they don't have anything else to watch. I think it's just a really good angle that I'm interested to see, what kind of numbers they'll pull with that type of an event.
I agree. I think it's going to get interesting, though, because like what I was talking, and I'm going to do a Tough Guys podcast here in a little bit with Max, but a lot of people were complaining about how Tough finished up, and I was saying that it's a tough thing to ask these guys to say you're in the finale of Tough. If you win, you're in the UFC. But now go out and have an exciting fight. Well, I'm just trying to get this W. Right. So I am interested to see if that when we get to the end of this, if these guys are going for it because it's $1 million, or if they're just trying to get the win. So that'll be interesting. But yeah I mean,
if the thing that I just kind of thought in my head, like anything with $1 million on the line has people watching. Like you see the basketball games, they'll pull some fat guy out of the crowd, and he'll be chucking up half court shots, and everybody will be zoomed in, watching it. So I'm sure when there's, when the $1 million is there and there's people punching each other in the face on national television, I'm sure they'll do well. So I'm super stoked, man. And I know you are too. And
that's true.
Keep talking about it all the way there.
Absolutely. All right, guys, there you have it. That's the PFL show number 3 for Nolan King. I'm John Franklin. Thanks for all your support. Be sure and listen to all of our podcasts on the MMA Today Podcast Network. There will certainly be more. I have a Hall of Fame podcast coming out where I interviewed Art Davey. I'll be doing a Tough Guys with Max Friedman. Max Friedman did a Matchmaker podcast with Jordan Colbert. So there is a ton of content just waiting to be listened to. So go ahead and listen to it. We will see you next time. Peace.